On this day in history, December 16th, 1773, as part of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party occurs, in which members of the Sons of Liberty disguised as Mohawk Indians dump hundreds of crates of tea into Boston Harbor as a protest against the Tea Act. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Boston during the Revolutionary period, and featuring narration from my friend Osword.
The period of the colonial wars quickly merges itself into the days of uncomfortable relations with the mother country, becoming more and more strained until open revolt merged itself into the American Revolution. The questions were largely financial, although the Quebec Act, which recognized the entity of the Roman Catholic Church in the province, gave Protestant citizenship in the colonies some uneasiness. The first important outward manifestation of discontent came in Boston when Paxton, the collector of customs, through a deputy at Salem, petitioned the court for writs of assistance, established under Charles II, which would enable the customs officers to enter their homes and warehouses in the exercise of their duty. On a hearing of the petition, James Otis made a dramatic plea built largely around the legal axiom that an Englishman's house is his castle. The writs having been established in legislation by the British Parliament, the court sustained the officers of the crown. But Otis had profoundly stirred the people, and as John Adams said afterwards, then and there, the child independence was born. This was in 1761. The Sugar Act of 1764 was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which was strenuously resisted. On August 26, 1765, the most destructive and disgraceful riot of the period targeted and attacked the house of Hutchinson, then Lieutenant Governor, and later Chief Justice, gutted it and destroyed the magnificent library containing irreplaceable sources of Massachusetts history. Other and soberer methods were legitimately and effectively used. Businessmen refused to use the stamps. Trade came to a practical standstill as the tax stamps had to be affixed to invoices and other written evidences of transactions. Even the courts closed for lack of triable causes, for the writs and all other documents had to be stamped. The Stamp Act was a failure and nothing remained for Parliament to do but repeal it, which is what they did in 1766. Of all American towns, Boston was the most enthusiastic in this opposition. Back of Boston was the Caucus Club of all active citizens bent on influencing opinion and action. The most influential member of this club was Samuel Adams, whose activities had given him the title of Father of the American Revolution. With the repeal of the Stamp Act came the Declaratory Act, in which Parliament declared its right to tax the colonies. Under this declaration of policy, the Townshend Acts were passed, placing duties on lead, glass, papers, paint, and tea. The merchant class were not revolutionaries at heart, but they had made a common cause with Sam Adams and the proletariat for trade purposes. Probably, they thought, they were making use of Sam Adams for their own purposes, while he was quite as certain that he was using them for his. The time was to come when he would lead them further away than they would have initially intended, and found themselves in a position from which they could not draw back from. The matter was now so acute that it had mounted to chronic defiance, and 2 regiments of regulars were dispatched to Boston and camped on the Common, being denied housing among the citizens. Friction was inevitable. At last, on March 5, 1770, a group began to harass a sentinel on King, now State Street, near the townhouse. Finally, the squad that was called to support the sentinel fired into the group, killing several men. The Boston Massacre, as this clash was to be called, showed that after this, troops could not be quartered in the town without a danger to both the citizens and the troops. A committee with Sam Adams at its head demanded the withdrawal of the regiments to Castle William. Hutchinson, now acting governor, demurred and sought to compromise on 1 regiment. But to Adams' reply, quote, "both regiments or none," he yielded. It became evident to the British Parliament that these acts could not be enforced and were repealed, except the tax on tea, which was kept for the assertion of the principle involved. Samuel Adams and his associates led the opposition to this principle. Finally, 3 ships bearing cargoes of tea arrived in the harbor and were moored at Griffin's Wharf. For several days, there were conferences and meetings in which Adams played the leading part, looking towards the return of the ships without landing the tea. On December 16, 1773, at the close of a town meeting, which adjourns with Adams' statement, quote, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country," a group of citizens, largely responsible men, disguised more or less thoroughly as Indians, proceeded to the wharf, boarded the vessels, opened their chests, and threw the tea into Boston Harbor. So entirely was the mob an orderly one, and the radical act so conservatively carried out that it was evinced not as a spontaneous act, but a carefully premeditated one. It was an act which could only be passed unnoticed if the government intended to waive all but ostensible sovereignty. This it was not prepared to do, and the Boston Port Bill was the result. This closed the port of Boston, and, as this was meant to ruin the city, it precipitated a formal revolt. More troops were sent in to preserve the order. Gage, in command, was a rather mild administrator and did his best in trying circumstances. The colonies formed a skeleton military organization called the Minutemen, prepared to muster on the shortest possible notice, and gathered ammunition and supplies. Gage promptly sent a detachment to that part of Charleston, now Somerville, and destroyed some of these stores. In April 1775, he decided to send a secret expedition to capture or destroy military stores in Concord. His plans were suspected by the insurgents, and his movements noted. On the evening of April 18th, an expedition was sent out. By an agreed plan of signals, Paul Revere, waiting at the Charlestown shore, learned the route by which it had started and, on a horse borrowed for that purpose, rode through the country, arousing the inhabitants. He was joined by William Dawes, who had left Boston by another route, and by the time the regulars reached Lexington Green, their pathway was obstructed by a small company of Minutemen. This was the first armed resistance. After an exchange of volleys in which 8 of the militia were killed, they gave way. The regulars proceeded to Concord, but found that the greater part of the stores had been carried to safety. There occurred the fight at the bridge, in which both sides lost men, and the withdrawal of the British. As the Minutemen came in from the countryside, they harassed the British column until the withdrawal became a retreat and the retreat a rout. This, the American Revolution, began with British troops out of Boston contesting with militia aroused by Boston men. The war was accepted by the colonies. Siege was immediately laid to the town by a ring of half-forts erected on the land side. These New Englanders were reinforced by troops from other colonies. The Continental Congress, though it had not yet declared independence, made George Washington commander-in-chief of the American armies. Before he reached Cambridge, General Ward, then in command, sent a detachment of troops under Prescott and Putnam to fortify Bunker Hill and Charleston, which commanded the town on the north. Howe, then in command of the British forces, decided to carry the hill by storm. The colonials were courageous men and excellent marksmen. They repelled the first attack with great slaughter. A second was made. The steady Britishers were forming and mounting the hill again, only to meet another sanguinary repulse. On the third attack, the ammunition of the colonials were exhausted, and after a bayonet struggle, they made an orderly and soldierly retreat. Technically a victory for the British, it was purchased at such a cost it gave the colonies great encouragement, and its anniversary is still celebrated in Boston to this day. The siege continued unabated until, after the colonials occupied Dorchester Heights closely overlooking the town, Howe evacuated the city on March 17, 1776. Boston was never again in the theater of war during the Revolution. During this evacuation, Howe offered those still loyal to the Crown evacuation up to Halifax, Canada. 4 years before the Treaty of Peace was signed, a convention was held in Boston and formed a state government for Massachusetts. The town, under the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, maintained the old town meeting system.